Right?
Exactly. We should be live streaming now.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back to Four Rabbis, Unlimited Opinions. It's a treat to be here with my friends, with Carney, Jim, and Rory, Rabbi Carney Rose, Rabbi Jim Bennett, and Maharat Rory Pickernice. In a moment, just as a reminder, let's all introduce the organizations that we're a part of too, because I know we get asked that regularly by folks who aren't familiar. I'm being told that you can't hear me.
I can hear you. Are other people having trouble hearing?
I hear you.
Okay.
Other people say they hear. So Shulamit, we think it might be yours.
Can you hear? Yes. I don't know if you can hear the rest of us. And otherwise, you can always try to restart.
So we're going to be talking anti-Semitism today. We're going to be talking about the experiences in particular that us as 21st century American Jews are having in our day-to-day lives with anti-Semitism. I think sometimes it may come as a bit of a surprise to many folks, just what it's like to be a public Jew in the United States today. So we're going to be talking about this. We're going to be talking about anti-Semitism through a few different lenses. We're going to look at anti-Semitism, white nationalist anti-Semitism here in the United States. We're going to talk about the experience of Muslim anti-Semitism in the United States. We're going to talk about left-wing anti-Semitism, in particular, the places that it does and does not connect with anti-Zionism as well. And we're going to be talking about all of these manifestations. So before we begin, I want to invite Rabbi Carney Rose to share a text to really sort of locate us in place, in space, in Jewish time when it comes to these issues. So I think Rory is going to share something and Carney's going to talk.
For a change. So we're hoping to see the text at any moment, but the text we're going to introduce is a text from the Haggadah, which is quite familiar to many of us. It is the text that begins, V'hi she'amda la'avotenu. Wow, it's really big. V'hi she'amda la'avotenu, right? And it is this that has stood for our ancestors and for us, since it is not only one person or nation that has stood against us to destroy us, but rather in each generation they stand against us to destroy us. But the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be God, rescues us from their hand. And of course, as we said, this V'hi she'amda, sometimes we sing it, sometimes we say it, sometimes we repeat it over and over again throughout the Haggadah. It seems to be a motif. And we could say that this is a tremendous example of how the Haggadah itself is focusing us on the notion of anti-Semitism, which at least according to this text has been around since the beginning of time, right? V'hi she'amda. This is what ultimately has been the standing position, right? This is the ongoing existential reality of where Jews find themselves in every generation. And one way or another, the Holy Blessed One intervenes on our behalf. And so we move from the difficult moment, from the narrow place to a place of expansiveness, right? And that is, I think, what the text says here. There's much that we can say, and we're going to have each of us reflect on it. And since, as they say in the Talmud, once you have the shofar, blow. So I have the shofar, and I want to make the case that this V'hi she'amda is something interesting. I read this in a Haggadah that's attributed to the Mekubalim, to Kabbalists. If everybody will take a look at the word V'hi, which is the first word of this section, V'hi she'amda, this particular Kabbalistic explanation says, what is it that has stood the test of time? It's not the anti-Semitism, it's not the hatred, but rather something else. When it says V'hi she'amda, it stands for something that begins with a vav or is represented by a vav, something that is represented by a hey, something that's represented by a yud, and something that's represented by an aleph. And I'm sure that I could go around with our colleagues and we could go through what is represented by a Vav and what's represented by a Hey and what's by a Yud and what an Aleph. And for those of you who like to play around with these Kabbalistic notions of gematria, etc., we know that every letter in the Hebrew alphabet, right, represents a number as well. Vav is 6, Hey is 5, Yud is 10, and Aleph is 1. So let's work backwards, right? Look at this text. Let's start with the Aleph. If it has a numerical value, it is 1, right? And what is 1? Who knows 1? Going back to the Haggadah, 1 is Hashem, 1 is God, right? Is Adonai, right? Then what would the Yud be? Yud would be what's 10? 10 are the Luchot Habrit, right? The tablets that Moses brought down to the children of Israel with the 10 commandments, the 10 utterances, often mistranslated as the 10 commandments. Next would be what? The Hey. What is the Hey? The Hey is the 5 books of the Torah, the Chumash, right? And the Vav finally is what? 6, Shisha, Sidrei, Mishnah. It is the Mishnah. So when we read this section of the Haggadah or chant this section of the Haggadah, we tend to focus on what? On the negativity, right? Rather than see that it's not simply HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, who swoops down in some kind of ethereal way, but rather God has already given us in the world some tools to address the challenges that we face. And they are what? They are the Mishnah, they are the Torah, they are the Dibrot, the utterances, and of course it is God, God's self, who is present in our lives. I just thought that was a wonderful way in which to initiate this conversation, which will probably take many twists and many different turns. I already know that we're not going to agree on this, which is what makes this wonderful. By the way, I'm not even sure I'm going to agree with myself during the course of this conversation. But that means I'm learning, I'm growing, and of course, I thank my colleagues for being with us. But I wanted just to leave that as the beginning. Vihi she'amda. What is it that sustains us? Some might say that what sustains us is a supernatural power. Some might say it is the great gifts of Jewish tradition, the texts of our people. And some might actually say, and maybe somebody today will argue, that this whole notion of anti-Semitism has in some level been one of the rallying cries for the established Jewish community as maybe a good tool and maybe a very poor tool, maybe a positive tool, maybe a negative tool for rallying people around an agenda, which can be both a blessing and potentially a deep, deep curse for us as a community. With that being said, I thank you for the opportunity to start. I wish we could sing this, one of my favorite pieces. Maybe, you know the old saying, every rabbi is a frustrated chazan, except in those congregations where the rabbi is the chazan, and in those congregations are frustrated. So I'm not going to sing because I don't want to take over Chazanish jobs. But thank you so much, Rabbi Daniel, for giving me the opportunity to initiate with a little bit of a Kabbalistic insight.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciated your framing around sort of a positive read of this text, which has such an overtly, I think on its face, negative sort of anti-Semitic connotation. Right, because that's the other thing in our conversation today that I hope we don't lose sight of, that as we're talking about anti-Semitism and what I see is rapidly growing anti-Semitism in the United States, we're also living at the golden age, right? There has never been, I truly believe it, there has never been as wonderful of a moment to be a Jew as this moment right now, with the flourishing of American Jewry, with the flourishing of Israeli Jewry. But with that being said, I want to turn us towards where we see as individuals anti-Semitism going in the next 10 to 15 years. I'm going to start by framing this around just my experiences with anti-Semitism in the last month or so. So just about every month, at least at CRC, I'm assuming that you all experience something similar. We have a coordinated online harassment campaign that happens where 3, 4, 5, 6 folks all at once will join in, and across all of the various places where we send our streams, we'll have all sorts of comments, kikes to the oven, finish Hitler's job, these sorts of things. It happens constantly. Autumn, who's helping to produce this, deals with it, as does their volunteers. And I've become so inured to it, I think, just it's so common at this point, that I almost forget it as being a significant thing, except we had 2 volunteers who were helping to produce the stream a couple weeks ago, and they were incredibly shaken. At least once a week, I experience some other form of online hatred, anti-Semitism, messages sent to me personally, messages on Twitter, messages on Facebook, messages left on our streams. And then this last week, we had a specific threat of violence against CRC over Shabbos. And once again, had extra security, once again, had thankfully Scott Biondo there. But once again, we're dealing with specific threats. I'm teaching a class at Eden Seminary to future Christian ministers right now, and had them at CRC last week. And I was struck by all of the other ways that we physically have anti-Semitism in our lives that we just take for granted now. How outside of CRC, and I know it's true of all of our facilities, we have these nice sort of landscape-looking blocks that look like areas to sit on, but of course they are there to prevent a car from ramming into our sanctuary, where we have multiple levels of doors to get into any of our buildings with security omnipresent, where every Jewish organization that I know of spends $50,000 and rapidly rising on security costs year after year after year, not even talking about infrastructure security costs, dollars that could and should be spent on programming much more core to our mission. Right, it's a tax that America places in some ways on Jewish institutions. So this is really different than at least I understood my childhood as a Jew in St. Louis to be. So I want to turn this over to the three of you and ask, where do you see anti-Semitism going in the next 10 to 15 years? And maybe the other places to throw in some resonance here too are the loud and vocal anti-vax, anti-mask protests at some of our city council meetings that veer into anti-Semitism, the January 6th insurrection, and the fact that we just had 6 insurrectionists elected to various positions. It feels like all of this is a part of a bigger wave. So who'd like to go? Who'd like to talk first? Again, with the idea of where do you see anti-Semitism going in the next 10 to 15 years in our institutions, in our lives here in the United States as American Jews?
So I can jump in. I mean, thank you, Daniel. That was just so poignant, and I think just very hard to follow, especially, the vulnerability with which you're sharing all of these really difficult stories. And I want to acknowledge, even as I want to build to your question, I want to acknowledge that I think this is such a hard place for us to grapple. First of all, it's painful because obviously anti-Semitism is terrifying. And I think also as a Jewish community, nobody's going to say that anti-Semitism is not a real and present danger, right? What I mean by that in the sense that I think, right, like even if somebody's not experiencing it right now, there's always that fear that, if one of us were to say that and then something were to happen tomorrow, then where would we all be, right? Like, because of course, right, like no one can ever guarantee what a future looks like. So I want to like sit with the very real stories that you've shared, and I want to acknowledge that many of us might have different stories, and many of us, including the ones who are speaking and the ones who are listening. And I want to just kind of name, I think, some of that discomfort, because who among us, I remember living in New York after 9/11 when there was like that color-coded system, right? So you was like, we were like on orange alert, and I remember thinking like, no, like we're never going to be green, right? Like no one's ever going to be able to say like we're safe, because who can promise, right? None of us can see the future. So I just want to like kind of sit with that within this as well. And I think I also want to kind of step back a little bit to say, as we talk about anti-Semitism, I think we're talking about very, very real threats. I think we're talking about, when I say threats, I mean like the fear of personal attack. I think the rhetoric that you've described, right, and I think that rhetoric is scary because so often that rhetoric has led to physical attacks. But I think also for me, I sit with a lot of the discomfort of the stereotypes that many people don't even realize that they're a part of, or not kind of realizing. So I don't tend to talk as much about anti-Semitism as much as I find myself talking about anti-Semitic rhetoric or anti-Semitic tropes, right? And to me, part of this is a really important distinction, because I think very often the people who are saying these things, not the people, look, the people who are coming on and saying like Jews back to the ovens, I think is no question, right? But I think very often, like more for me, I find myself with people who genuinely would never consider themselves anti-Semitic, would even think of themselves as people who are really good friends with Jews, or who, want to be embracing of Jews, who don't realize that the things that they say are actually, things that might be scary. And so, like, I can give an example where I had coffee with somebody the other day. They were introducing me to somebody who was from a different country, and so, it was like, as they said this person's name, and I won't use, right, but it was like, this is Joe. Joe's from Vietnam. This is Rory. Like, it was like Joe Vietnam, Rory Israel. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm from America. Right. And I think that's like an important, right, where, because partially, and I explained afterwards, I said, look, I need you to know, I know you were trying to just say like, I'm from the Jewish community, but I need you to understand that this accusation that Jews can't be loyal to the countries, or we're not citizens of the countries that we live in because we're loyal to another country, is an anti-Semitic trope that has been used to kick Jews out of their countries, to denaturalize Jews, to say that Jews are no longer welcome in places. And so I need to be very clear, right? Not like I don't visit Israel, like we've spent a lot of time talking about Israel, right? But like, as soon as he said that, like my heart just jumped, right? And he wasn't me, like he was being kind of cute about it. And I was like, shut this down right now. But I had the need to kind of explain to him, to say, I need you to understand the backdrop to this. And so I also find, and I find myself having these really scary reactions, because I think the more that also that rhetoric is allowed to take hold, the more like people don't realize, but then there's like insidious ideas just start, right? So like, he didn't mean anything by it, but the more people start to kind of be like, oh, Jews aren't really focused on America, or all Jews are focused on foreign interests, right? Like that, like you just need that to, right, that keeps on rising. And then suddenly we start to get into what I find to be very, very scary territory. So I don't know what the future of America is. I simultaneously hold, like, where I do see these attacks. I also, for me, I see more than any other time when these attacks happen, leadership speaking up against these attacks. So, you referenced, Daniel, the city council meetings, but I stood next to the county council meetings specifically, and I stood next to Sam Page when, like, within a day, he was like, I want to hold a press conference to condemn this, and I need people to be standing next to me. We saw, like, I think about, like, look, we just had the anniversary of the horrific attacks at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, but you all were there when 2,500 people showed up within a day's notice. And stood alongside us. And so I sit with that, right? Like, these attacks are real, and I don't know what the future is, but I also know that there are people in this country who are quick and who are powerful voices, who stand alongside us, who condemn. And so I'm a little bit, I guess, kind of like with the Mr. Rogers, right? Like, in scary situations, look for the helpers, right? Like, do we, to me, like, some of the time I think there's a few people who are the people who, think it's funny to come onto the CRC calls and to do these horrific things, right? But like, there's so many more voices that are ready to stand alongside us when that happens.
Jim, what about you? Where do you see anti-Semitism going?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking. So I want to go back to the text that Carney started with, and just make a comment. There's so many beautiful readings of that text, and the mystical one you shared, Carney, it was really beautiful. But I'm also drawn to another more simple and literal reading of that text. It says, whenever we feel ourselves and see ourselves to be victims, we should not think that there's just one enemy. So, I think this text, as I read it, was saying, don't think that Pharaoh was the only enemy of the Jewish people, but rather there's always those who are going to rise up against us individually or as a people. And I want to say first, I am not an anti-Semitism denier. I don't believe that there is no such thing as hatred of Jews as Jews. Clearly there is, and there always has been. And I sadly would say, and there probably always will be, just as there are those who hate other groups that they see as other, be it people of different color skin or different sexual orientation or different nationality or different political beliefs, that the Jewish people are not unique in having been throughout history seen as other and treated as other, to even to the extreme of these anti-Semitic things that in every generation are always have occurred and always will occur. At the same time, I want to respond to your question, Daniel, and say, and I say this with as much humility as I can muster when I say it. This has not been my personal experience in my life as a Jew, nor has it been my experience in my career as a rabbi, nor even is it my experience now as a Jew in the 21st century living in St. Louis. When I hear stories like you shared and so many other terrible, from the most horrific, we call the Tree of Life shooting to mind, or numerous others, or the specific, online attacks that you've experienced and threats. When I hear them, they make me terribly sad, but I do not experience those. Look, I'm not inviting somebody to prove me wrong here. I have not personally experienced them. What I've experienced in my life is, an occasional ignorant person, an occasional stupid person, an occasional truly prejudiced, mean-spirited person who says or does things that occasionally become in the world around us horrifying. But these are no different than, for me, in my experience, than any other horrifying hatreds that occur. And I actually would say this with great personal conviction. I think we make a big mistake when we focus upon anti-Semitism and say we are victims. Because I think if we look objectively at history, not the trajectory of our own lives, things were more peaceful when I was growing up as a kid 50, 60 years ago. There was less evidence explicitly of, this kind of public hatred, but there was less of all the hatred in those days than there is today. We are much more, divided as people and communities and ideologies. I think when we look at the trajectory of history, there's probably never, as you said, Daniel, it's a golden age. We have never been less victim in history than we as Jews are today. Israel is a strong, powerful nation. The Jewish people have flourished and succeeded as individuals and as people throughout history and across the globe. And I think we make a terrible mistake when we as individuals and as a Jewish community glorify anti-Semitism, manipulate anti-Semitism, use it as a fundraising mechanism or a community building mechanism. And when we create a panic, when at least personally, I don't think there should be a panic. I disagree with the premise that you put on the table. I do not see a precipitous rise in anti-Semitism. And I want to just say one other thing now to plant a seed for later in the conversation. I think sometimes the worst anti-Semitism we as a Jewish community are experiencing is the internal anti-Semitism, the hatred of one member of the Jewish community against another, and the way we treat each other. And that includes Israel and Zionism, and the way people are treated by the Jewish community for their positions on Israel and Zionism and Palestinian issues. But on many others, the way the Jewish community is so divided within, that's the greatest threat, not anti-Semitism from the outside.
Thank you, Rabbi Bennett. That's really beautiful. And I agree with many of the things that you've said. And I think I would have agreed almost totally with you till about 2 years ago. And somehow or another, something just feels different to me about the era in which we find ourselves. Maybe you're not experiencing it. I understand where you're coming from. And I also would agree with you. I don't think we need to get hyperbolic about this at this moment in time, right? And I also want to agree that these are golden eras and we have so many opportunities and we are so very blessed. Take a look at a community like ours and the kinds of creative flourishing that's happening And really, it is unbridled in many, many kind of ways. Rabbi Lipnick, blessed memory, always used to say the Jewish community can do anything it wants to do. And I believe that that's the case. And that probably was not the case in many past generations. So in fact, I actually read the V'hisha Amda section in a little different way than maybe historically it's been, or even the way in which we first presented it, right? But we all know it's not just one, right? There's always going to be people in every era who are going to dislike us, or going to hate us, who are going to try to destroy us. That's the reality of being a minority. That's the reality of being an Am Segula, a treasured nation, as every nation is, right? There's always somebody who's not going to like you. I wish it was easier. You know, when my kids were little, we dealt with little problems. Like, oh, somebody in the class doesn't like me. That's the reality of living. The question is, how does one sustain oneself without the perfection until the Messianic era, right, of everybody getting along, right? The lion and the lamb are not lying together today. Maybe someday they will. And to me, that's an important part of this conversation. So I would say, though, that like Rabbi Bogart, I'm starting to see little hints of it. We never really talked about security. And I can tell you how we know that. We just built this new building, right? We spent a lot of money building this building, right? And there's a lot of glass in this building. And it was interesting that as we saw incidences, little incidences, not God forbid, you know, this is not Kristallnacht, which of course we're going to commemorate this evening, right? But in the back of people's minds, and maybe Rabbi Bennett, this has to do with the fact that this is an overlay that we spent too much time, right, integrating into our essences, and we're sort of looking for anti-Semitism, right, looking under every rock, knowing that it might be there. Maybe that's it. But somehow or another, we've had more calls. We've had more moments of people in the parking lot that we didn't understand, you know, might be interested in doing something bad. We have the day school here too. They've had calls, lockdowns, shutdowns. We haven't had, I don't remember those things growing up. And I grew up in Canada. I grew up with a highly, right, a highly unhappy Ukrainian population, right, who really didn't like the Jewish community and felt the Jewish community taking advantage of the Shoah and to our own benefit. And there were a lot of little things that happened during the course of time. I don't think I felt it until now. So I think we're at a liminal moment. And I actually think somebody else has already said this, that it's not just within our community. Hatred is proliferating. Hatred is growing. Lack of respect for one another internally and externally in our world is fomented, has been fomented, and continues to be fomented. And I think our job as Jews is to do whatever we can, right, to help ourselves, save ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I don't mean the Jewish community. I mean our world from this terrible plague which is upon us of hatred and the inability to have a sense of coexistence, right? You don't always have to be right. You don't always have to have the last word. You don't always have to be able to be the one who comes out on top. And you don't have to beat your opponent, right, to a pulp. And I think that's the reality that I'm seeing increasing. And so, as with all, you know, the tide raises all the ships, it's exactly the opposite. The negativity, the wave of negativity highlights all anti-anything, right? So white supremacy, right? We see all anti-gay, lesbian, LGBTQ community, all those things that we're seeing that are driving us absolutely crazy. We can't understand it, and the narrow-mindedness. And I will say one other thing that disturbs me, and then I'll hand it back over. But Rabbi Bennett talked about the internal Jewish communal. I find it so sad that if people who have experienced as much maligning as we have experienced, that we can contribute in ways that are very subtle. And I mentioned this, that when I lived in Japan, there was an anti-Semitism of emulation. People wanted to be like Jews, right? The number one selling book when I lived in Tokyo was How to Do Business Like a Jew. And the Japanese didn't even see that as a negative, but we understood it as a negative. We heard such titles of books, right? Right, Rothschild and all the kinds of things that people would say about us, that we automatically had, you know, a lot of money and we had all the power. That we do that now. We as Jews sometimes cast aspersions on other groups and cast them with one big broad brushstroke without nuance. And nuance is going to be the key, I think, in this era to addressing the issues of hatred that are plaguing us all and will ultimately take us, I think, into tohu vavohu, and not in a good way, right, into this tabula rasa, which we cannot live with as a community. So I wanted just to mention that because I agree with you that there's this terrible hatred internally, but we are also spewing some ugly stuff as a community out there, and we're not even sure, I'm not even sure that we even know that we're doing it. And we should be more self-aware and more self-conscious.
If I can build off of what you just said, Carney, because I think what you said is incredibly important. And I want to also lift up, like, I definitely think that hatred in general is rising, but I think I want to like put a fine point on that in terms of saying, I think it's like very easy for many of us to see it as something that's happening external. Like those people seem really angry, but I actually want to like include all of us within it, because I think part of the way that we're seeing it, right, it's this righteous indignation that's kind of taken over, right? If I'm not angry about something else, then I'm not actually passionate enough about my cause, right? You know, like I can't just be pro whatever, like I have to be committed to destroying the other people. And so, you know, as we talk about this, you know, yes to everything that you said, but it's also, it's not even just anti-LGBTQ, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, right? Like it's the way that all of us, and I think we all know, whether we can recognize it in ourselves or we see it in our circles, right? The way that people are quick to shut down, right? Like you're either on my side or you are pro-death, you are pro-destruction, you are pro, you know, whatever it is. And so we all have to take responsibility for that, right? I want to lift up, because I think what you're saying is important, but I want to say, like, you're speaking to us. You're not speaking about them. You're speaking to all of us right now.
Could I add something, and also a little bit of response to some of the questions I see coming in the chat? I want to make sure that we're all recognizing the similarity of the positions we're all taking. There are clearly anti-Semitic incidents, and it is certainly possible that there are more of them happening today than there were last year or 10 years ago or 50 years ago. I'm not convinced that that is true. I'm also not willing, I'm not a statistician, I'm not willing to go and analyze the statistics. I do think that we should acknowledge the possibility that the combination of the forms of communication that exist in our world today, in particular the instantaneous social media world where truth and fiction blur and reality becomes perpetuated in ways that, you know, is or is not always accurate reflection of truth. And that coupled with the fact that there is an institutional benefit that is manipulated and used by institutions to tell this story, because quite frankly, and I'm just going to be blunt, it's a great way to rally your community together around a common enemy. And it's a great way to raise funds around a common cause. And it's a great way, and I'll give you a specific example of this. In the early 2000s, following the attacks in New York of 9/11 and in Washington, D.C., there was a tremendous amount of money raised for security, quote, security, in Jewish communal life and outside of Jewish communal life, just in America. Anybody and everybody was willing to contribute for the illusion of, or for the reality of, security. We all subjected ourselves to that narrative. We all accepted it. We started taking our shoes off when we went through the airport. We were willing to pay charges that we had never paid before for the illusion of security, all because of a real incident that really happened. But were all of us truly at risk? I think we could ask that question still today, 20 years later. Were we really daily at risk? I don't know. And I'm not convinced that the report of, 82% of Americans report that anti-Semitism has increased or believe that it has increased. I think you need to parse that much more carefully and ask, does that mean that I saw it on the internet? That I saw a meme? I saw it on Facebook? I saw it on Instagram or Twitter that people are reporting it? Is that qualify? Do 82% of American Jews actually report personally having been victimized by anti-Semitism? I seriously doubt that. And I think we need to be very, very careful about what we say and what we do and how we respond. And I will go back and say, I don't believe we are the most victimized population today. There are much more vulnerable populations than the Jewish community, notwithstanding that, yes, anti-Semitism is horrible when it happens.
I want to just add to my dad, Rabbi Neil, grew up in Brooklyn. And whenever he says the word program, it comes out pogrom, right? And I was thinking about that as Rabbi Bennett just said what he said, right? Sometimes the pogrom is the program. In other words, we build off this negativity in order to benefit a cause. And I'm not even sure we're aware of it. I don't want to make it so Machiavellian, right? I think people just don't realize that it's an easy way in which to drum up business, right? The pogrom becomes the program. And I remember that when I was a student activist, when I was in college, one of the things that we did was, the best way to get people to do something, right, to move off the dime, is to talk about a crisis and maybe to even fabricate or engineer a crisis. And so I appreciate that. By the way, I just would say in general that the Jewish community has enough real crises that need to be addressed. So creating them, like, enough is enough. I also want to add just, another piece to this conversation. I'm so glad that Rabbi Bogart, you kind of really introduced this to us. I am tremendously fearful of coming down on one side or another because I really don't want to be proven wrong. Okay. So I wanted to stay, shomrim afked le'ircha. I want to stand on guard. Right? I grew up in Canada, so I stand on guard. Right. But I really want to stand on guard. I think we're at a wait and see moment in time. And I don't want to cast my vote with there is no anti-Semitism and it's not on the rise, and all those kind of games. And I think of the things that you said, by the way, are really spot on, Rabbi. And I actually put it in the chat that I think that the news cycle and the way in which we do it changes the whole, it's a game changer for everything. But I just want to stand on guard. And I think that if we can do anything as leaders in the community at this moment in time is to say, let's wait and see. Let's not begin yet to hyperventilate, but let us not turn a blind eye to what could become, right, very difficult for our community. And also let us not turn a blind eye to what's already been said, that our responsibility is not just the tip of our nose or the edges of the denominations or the post-denominations or the end of the Jewish community. We don't want to live in a world where people are destroying one another, right? That's not what we were here for. We weren't put in this world as humans and as Jews to do anything but to make the place le'ovda v'leshomra, to work it and to protect it and to bring value added. God, we are God's, stake in human history, Shashler used to say, right? We are the return on investment that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, puts into the world. So we got to find ways to reach across these divides and to work. And I think if we did that internally and externally, a lot of what we see would begin to dissipate. And I think we would be able to have a little bit more anecdotal, at least, data on how much is hatred really happening. Because I got to tell you, how many people come here and say beautiful things. And I know Bharat Rory may want to say this, but I see a rise in philo-Semitism. I see more interest in Judaism. Our introduction to Judaism classes are filled with interesting people. Some who are interested in conversion. Okay, that's true. But many of them are not there for conversion. They're simply there to learn, right? They see themselves as branches, but they want to learn about the root. They want to understand where they come from. They want to understand the Bible. They want to understand rabbinic tradition. They want to understand what would Jesus have done, right? They want to understand where Jesus came from and his tradition. And I think that's a beautiful moment in time. And I want to take advantage and capitalize on that because I think that would diminish in many, many ways. And so if I ask myself, the rise in anti-Semitism is over 80% incidence, blah, blah. What about the rise of philo-Semitism? Is it equal? Does it balance itself out in some kind of way? Are we making inroads? And by the way, I think the Maharat probably can talk about this more than anybody else. The number of calls she gets from interested people who want to understand about Judaism. I'm watching because, the student to student is something that my kid participates in. My kid comes home and talks to me about how exciting, all four of my kids have done this, what exciting interchanges they have. what opportunities they have meeting such fascinating, interesting, sensitive, and in some cases ignorant people with lots and lots and lots of questions, but interested, not from a place of being angry or hatred, but from a place of needing to understand and wanting to understand, yearning for a relationship.
Did you want to jump in, Daniel? Because I have other things I can say.
Go for it, Rory.
I just love so deeply what you just said, Carney, and I want to turn it into a call to action because this is where like we need a culture shift. We need a culture shift, and as I'm building up to it, I'm going to kind of preempt because I know, Daniel, when you introduced this, like you talked about anti-Semitism from all of these different places, and frankly, I actually hate those distinctions. Like I don't like. Like to me, like anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism, and if you're anti-Semitic because it's on the right or because you're on the left, like how you got there, like I think like this is also, you know, I'm with Jim in terms of us breaking our apart. Like not only are we breaking ourselves apart as a Jewish community, but the thing we fight about is whether or not something's anti-Semitism. You know, I mean, like what was it like yesterday? You had like Marjorie Taylor Greene quoting Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan, and you had like a couple summers ago David Duke retweeted Ilhan Omar, and like all these like I don't actually care like what it was bringing everyone together. You know, it's like if you hate Jews, like this is a problem. But you know, like I want to go back to also what I was saying before about some of this like righteous indignation and all of this stuff, right? Because what happens is that first of all, I've been told by Jewish communal professionals that there is no greater fundraiser than anti-Semitism. Like organizations are invested in this. And I think like first, so one call is like we all need to really ask ourselves because like the number of conversations I've had with people where people will be like say like I'm scared of something, and I'll say okay, what happened? And they'll say nothing happened. Someone told me, right? Like and all the time, right? I'll have coffee. People will say to me, you can't be a Zionist in a progressive space. And I'll say what progressive space were you in where you were attacked for being Zionist? And they'll say I wasn't, but I've heard that. Right? Or people will say, or exactly this, right? Like, you know, anti-Semitism is on the rise. And I'll say, what anti-Semitism have you experienced? And they'll say, I haven't, but I've been hearing about it. Right? Like, we all need to be doing better discernment. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be, like, I'm with Carney, right? Like, be on guard. Like, I'm not setting the level to green. I'm not saying throw all of this away. But until something, like I'm not looking to freak out until there's something to freak out about. But even when there's something to freak out about, I'm still not telling everyone to freak out because this is the other thing, right? Like this is where the righteous indignation comes in. So I want to share just a couple of stories to me, like what it highlights, right? So in 2017, many of us remember when the cemetery in University City was desecrated, right? And I want to be clear, right? That was not ultimately ruled an anti-Semitic attack, but that gets at the core because of, again, this is why I talk about anti-Semitic tropes, right? Historically, attacking Jewish cemeteries has been a precursor to many wider attacks on the Jewish community. So that hit us incredibly hard and we felt it in that way, not to mention, of course, many of us who had family members who were buried there, all of those other types of things. That attack was not ruled to be an anti-Semitic attack, but it did inspire copycat attacks in other cities across the country. And so I was talking to colleagues because they were suddenly facing similar things. So Jewish cemeteries across the country were desecrated. And I remember at one point sitting with one of my colleagues right after they had gotten word. We happened to be at a conference when they got word that their cemetery was attacked. And part of the problem was that when word got out that the cemetery was attacked, there were some rabbis who went to the cemetery, took out their phones, went on Facebook Live, recording themselves saying, I'm at the cemetery that was desecrated. Now, this became performative, right? And I was saying to my colleagues, like, and I was contacting because they were rabbis, right? So my colleagues in the JCRC were trying to get a hold of them. And I'm like going through other rabbinic colleagues to like get their cell phone number to say, get out of there and turn your phone off. Because what I had learned, which again, and these aren't things I would necessarily know, right? But one, like you don't amplify, so they're like zooming in on these tombstones. First of all, family members haven't been notified yet, right? That's like going to like a crime scene and you know, taking these videos before the family's been notified of the crime. I mean, it was a crime. Also, they were saying like, you don't amplify, so you don't need other, you know, anti-Semitic websites or whatever. Now you're like amplifying the names of these individuals, right? So like it was like a rigorous process, right? So people felt like, but now here's the problem. The problem is not just that the rabbis were doing this. It was a problem. The problem was that as a community, we want that, right? So these people were on Facebook Live, and all of these other people were saying, thank you for being there. Thank you for being a hero. Thank you for standing up against it. Thank you for speaking out. But what they didn't realize was that they weren't actually helping. Right. So similarly, I mean, I can't actually tell you. Let me just, can I tell one other story, Jim? And then the number of times where somebody has like a politician or somebody like this, Jim, you were saying, right? Like you've met idiots, right? Like someone said something stupid, right? Now, instead of me like going on Facebook and saying, I can't believe, right? I call them up. I call them up and I say, hi, you said this thing. I don't know if you realize that what you said is actually offensive. And I will tell you that like, I don't know, 6 out of 7 times, I don't know the right percentage, like the person apologizes and it never makes the news. And you don't know that it happened because I don't want you to know it happened, because if they said a stupid thing, right? They didn't say it like, you know, it wasn't like on CNN or whatever, right? Like, but I was at the meeting, it was whatever, like we overheard it. Now, I could fundraise a whole lot more if I went on Facebook Live and I said, I want to condemn, you know, like the number of people who are freaking, like I see people sharing these tweets and then I look at the person has like 10 followers. Like, why are you amplifying, right? So like what actually is helpful in this situation, right? Like what's helpful, and the way that this becomes performative is something that, this is the call to action that I'm building up to, is like as a community, we all feed into it. So if we want our leadership to be doing performative work and going on Facebook Live or tweeting out condemnations or getting irate about things, we can all do that. But I'm going to tell you now, it doesn't actually get rid of anti-Semitism, I would argue, right? Like it's much more powerful. And I can tell you that I am sure all of the others of you, I know that you've all had coffee, that you've all met with religious leaders of other faith traditions where you've said, hey, that comment was actually offensive, please don't say it again, or whatever it is. And nobody actually knows that that conversation happened because the person says, thank you for telling me, I never meant for it to be offensive. It's the end of it. And you didn't all go and right. But then we don't get our pictures in the paper for doing all of it, right? Like, so we need the community to want the real work to happen. Like if we're concerned about anti-Semitism, then all of you like move away from the performative. Don't give money because someone's telling you to be scared, right? If someone tells you to be scared, ask what really happened. Like we're, you know, let's like unpack it. If there's really an anti-Semitic incident, call me up. Like all of us will stand there. We will 100% show up. But you know, the number of parents who I keep getting calls, right? Parents are like, my kid's going off to college and I'm scared. What happened? Nothing happened, but I was told to be scared on college campuses. I was told to be scared, right? Like I need you to investigate that, but I need you to do that for us because we can't do the work that we need to do if everyone's waiting for us to be performative also. Sorry, Jim, that was longer than I told you I was going to give you, but
No, you, I'm glad you made me wait because you said it beautifully. I just wanted to use what you said as an illustration, a personal illustration of what I was trying to say earlier when I talked about us perhaps being our own worst enemies, and that our real enemies are not out there, but they are us and the way we treat one another. When that cemetery was desecrated in University City, my first instinct was to say, hold on a minute, do we know that that was an anti-Semitic act? And I was shouted down by members of the Jewish community who told me to stop being a stork, to stop sticking my head in the sand and pretending that anti-Semitism isn't exploding all around us. And I felt sadly vindicated when the end of the story came. But as you pointed out, and it's not just fundraising, it's ego and the need for recognition and to be the leading voice, to have the most likes on Facebook or Instagram, and to have followers listening to our shouts. And I fear that we are lemmings. We're leading ourselves over the cliff of fear. That's not to say there are enemies out there. That's what Vahisha Amdallah, there are in every generation people who hate us. But when we leap to that conclusion before we know the facts, and when we allow our ego and our desire for recognition and leadership, whether it's rabbis or communal leaders or just people who I just want to be the one to get it out there and forward that email, forward that post, share that image, that meme, before I even know the facts, we become our own enemies. And then we turn on one another and we create ammunition for people to say, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you people that you always go immediately to the conclusion that everybody hates you? That is not, there's a lot of hatred out there. A lot of people hate a lot of people. And as a number of people have pointed out, that has become a commonly accepted mode of operation in our society today. And that is the evil that we should be working against. And I think about the great anti-Semitic arguments revolving around Israel and Zionism and the Palestinians. When Jews start screaming at hating each other, when many of us are trying to call attention to the greater moral impulse to allow all people to live freely, self-determined, and instead we turn it into anti-Semitism of Jew against Jew, we are our own worst enemies, and we are the purveyors, ironically, of anti-Semitism.
So appreciate what you all said. And I think I agree with just about everything you said, Jim. I find myself these days sitting a little more where Carney's sitting. I think I really, really sat where you were sitting 5 years ago, and the amount of direct anti-Semitism I have experienced in the last 5 years. And I want to be clear, 5 years was 2015 and the rise of Trumpism. I also, when I think of the next 15 years, I know this will come as a deep surprise to the three of you. I am quite a pessimist when it comes to American democracy. I really believe American democracy is over. When we look out at the Senate, they're saying by 2040, 70% of the country will live in 15 states, which means that 30% of the country, overwhelmingly white, Christian, conservative, will control 70 Senate seats. Something like 40% of the presidential elections in my adult lifetime have gone to the white Christian loser of the popular vote. 5 of 9 Supreme Court justices right now are white Christians appointed by white Christians who lost the popular vote but won the white Christian vote, and approved by senates that did not represent the popular vote but instead represented the white Christian vote. I'm quite influenced by Eric Ward and his work, Skin in the Game. If people haven't read that essay, I so recommend it, where he shows the role that anti-Semitism plays in the theoretical and theological, in some ways, core of white nationalism different than white supremacy. And I look out and I see a Republican Party that in my eyes has become and is ever more becoming a white Christian nationalist party. And it terrifies me. It terrifies me about the future of this country, the future of democracy. I certainly don't believe that Jews are going to be on the front line of this, right? Queer folks and people of color, Black folks in particular, Muslims, right? Let's not forget that's where this started with the Muslim ban. And yet I'm quite pessimistic about the future of America and deeply pessimistic about the future safety of Jews in this country because of that. I mentioned the things that have happened recently, but I've also been on a train leaving the National Prayer Breakfast in 2016, where I was invited to speak because of anti-Islamophobia work I had been doing, and was accosted by someone right on the train, got right in my face and just screamed at me, "You kikes think you control the world. This isn't your place. It's not your country." While a train full of people, sat there and played on their phones and pretended like this wasn't happening as I got off at the next stop in the middle of nowhere, Maryland. And it just seems to be happening more and more. And I don't mean what I see in the news. I mean, what I experience in my life. I do wonder, there was a note in the chat about how CRC has always been sort of vocally pro-LGBTQ, a Black Lives Matter, pro-abortion rights. And I do wonder if part of the targeting is around that as well, right? It's worth remembering that Tree of Life Synagogue was targeted because of their work for immigrant advocacy. But yeah, I wish I still saw the world like I hear you seeing it, Jim. And I did see it. I mean, we talked about this many times, and I totally am on board and agree with you about the internal weaponization of anti-Semitism within the Jewish community, both for fundraising and for affiliation. Right? A lot of times, a lot of our places don't have so much of a sense of mission and why we're here and how we bring folks together. But anti-Semitism sure fills the seats and sells the tickets and raises the dollars. So I'm very much on board and agree with you there. I also just am more and more fearful about the country my children will live in.
You know, every once in a while, we rabbis give sermons we need to hear. So am I allowed to say something that I need to hear at this moment in time after this very sobering comment? Do you remember the end of Masechet Sotah? There's this wonderful statement about when this person died, this midah, this quality disappeared from the world. And when this person died, this midah, right? And at the very end, it says, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. De'ika ani, because I'm here. I just want to say De'ika ani, right? Anna, we are here, okay? We're not going anywhere. And Daniel, we need you. We need you to continue to fight this fight. In fact, I don't only mean that in terms of the Jewish community needs you. The world needs us. We're here for a reason, right? And I think the Kodesh Baruch, I'll say it again, like Heschel really got it right. We are God's stake in human history. And if we don't take the reins now, right, to pull a little bit and to guide a little bit, then I think we're giving up our obligation, responsibility, and great privilege to be a people who can make a difference. Every people has their mission, okay? I just hope that we could live out ours. And ours can make a sea change in the world. So I don't want to be pessimistic because, you know, I've seen and we've seen here again, Chris Talnach, right? What did my folks, by the way, my grandparents on my mother's side in particular, left in 33. Okay. And what would they have said today as they looked out? What would they do if they walked into a city like St. Louis and went to see our JCC and our federation and our amazing schools and right, all the things that we built on our day schools? And what would they have said? They would have never imagined in their wildest dreams that this could ever happen again. But
It's the
guess what?
Messianic era. Yeah.
It is, on some level, this is, if it's not the Messianic era, it's at least Chevlei Mashiach in a positive sense, right? So there are Chevlei Mashiach, there are the vicissitudes of trying to bring about change.
And I worry, Carney, I sorry to interrupt. I worry about the message that we are conveying to the next generation if we raise them in a world where we tell them that everybody is a boogeyman and that the hatred is rampant. And Daniel, to your earlier point as well, like, yeah, you're right. It's terrifying and it's scary to see American democracy so vulnerable, but that's not the message I want to preach. I want to preach, we got to get out there and do the work. And I know you mean that too. So, and about this anti-Semitism, I don't think we can underestimate, you know, everybody on this call is, you know, a grown-up and, you know, already capable of having our own visions as far as how we want our lives to unfold. But the message I'm not being Pollyanna. I'm deeply committed to the idea that we have to convey all those beautiful things you just talked about, Carney. We have to talk about the potential of good, not to wallow in the fear and the evil and the hatred, or else we become it. And that's what I fear.
I was going to add, you know, this notion that I think we're all familiar with, which is the notion of second naivete, not first naivete, but second naivete. I don't have naivete that there aren't bad things happening in the world. I don't live that way anymore. I tell that to my children when I put them to bed at night, you know, there are no boogeymen. And as they get older, they realize there are boogeymen and boogie women and lots of boogie going on in the world, right? But I choose to live my life as if. And I want to choose to live my life as if, and as a religious person, when I stand up and I daven for the state of Israel and I daven for the United States of America, and then it's followed by a tefillah l'shalom, I laminate all those things together. And I daven for those things, not because they're perfect now, but because I'm here l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, because I'm here to perfect the world. And that's the agenda, at least to make it better. I'm not going to get there, but I don't stop the work. It's got to happen. And so, yeah, Am I disturbed? I'm disturbed by many things, but I feel very much we need to contextualize and be really careful about it. And I don't want to sound overly avuncular because I'm so much older than you, Rabbi Bogart, but I also lived through those moments of real deep, dark sadness, right? Personal sadness, death of dreams that I had, right? But guess what? I woke up the next morning, V'Hashemesh zarcha, right? Ba'erev yalin bechi v'labokirina, right? We're crying in the nighttime. But guess what? The sun will rise the next day, and there will be hope for a better tomorrow. And I really believe that about America. I believe it about Israel. I believe it about Judaism. I believe about humanity, because I think the Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't create this world so it should become tohu vavohu again, right? I don't think so. I think that there is some cycle that we are going through that will require, but it's always been that way. And behold, or vador, right? In every generation, we have the work to do, and we have a very specific job in this moment in time. So I'm just so happy to be able to have this conversation, because like the rest of you, I could have fallen very easily into dikaon, into depression. I don't want to go there, because I think if we go there, down that rabbit hole goes a huge number of people who could use their energy to be better. You know, it's interesting. When I was diagnosed with cancer, one of the things I learned was that as I was suffering or unhappy or uncomfortable, there was always somebody who was more unhappy, suffering more uncomfortable than I. I'm 7 years later, I can talk about it. Lots of people who were going through the same thing can't talk about it. So I hope that we're having this conversation long into the future, and we can look back and say that was a difficult time, and that was a difficult time. And guess what? All these have been difficult time. To Ika Ani, we're still here, and we're still doing the work that needs to get done.
Beautifully said. And yes, right? Yes to all of that. And we're capable of holding all of those, right? That's the piece of this. Like, it doesn't have, right? Like, this can be a scary time and a hopeful time all at the same time. And this, like, none of us know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so I think we can choose all of it. But I think also to erase those other parts of the story is to erase the very real progress that's been made, or the good work that is happening, right? Because I also don't want to ignore the number of times that I've gotten texts from non-Jewish partners and friends because they heard about something that happened, right? Like the response that comes, like, yes, absolutely, there are people who want to see our destruction, and there are so many people who are willing to stand alongside us. And I don't want to forget that, right? I don't want that to be a part of the story that we're not telling, right? That, by the way, that's the story that I like to tell at JCRC, like, as a plug, right? Like, people keep saying, like, that doesn't fundraise as much as people telling people to be scared. I want to fundraise off of that, not just because I need money, but because I don't want to fundraise on the other story, right? I don't want that to be what we do. But I want to share.
I'm pledging $18 right now to JCRC.
Thank you,
okay.
Thank you, Rabbi. Right, but I want to share just as like a fun story. 6 years ago, actually. By the way, today's my 6th anniversary at the JCRC. I want you all to know. You all didn't get me a cake. I'm taking note of that, but 6 years. But so 6 years. So
we're going to take you to the doorway, and we're going to put an earring in your ear. You'll be indentured servant for life.
That's 7, yeah. So no, just before I started with JCRC, I had gotten I had an invitation. So before this, I'd been very involved in international interfaith work, particularly with the Catholic Church. And so it was the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, of the document that transformed the Catholic Church's relationship with the Jewish people, right? Which was monumental, right? I mean, after the Holocaust, where the church really did, and it's still doing it, it still needs to do it. I'm very aware that we live in a city called St. Louis, and right, like St. Louis, who the Catholics love to talk about the charity work that he did. We don't talk about the fact that he also burned the Talmud, right? Like, we can live with multiple truths all at the same time. But the Catholic Church really did a huge amount of introspection to say, what are the roots of anti-Semitism that we're responsible for, and how do we need to transform our understanding of the Jewish people? And they came out with this document, Nostra Aetate, fascinating history. We started talking a little bit with, like, this is also goes back to like Heschel and Soloveitchik and all that stuff we were talking about before. But so for the 50th anniversary, they were hosting this big conference in Rome, and I got invited to join the conference and to have not a private, but like to be part of like, I got to meet the Pope. I have this great picture of me with the Pope. And but I remember, I'm at this conference and I'm talking to somebody, and somebody says to me, like that morning, they said, "Hey, after we meet the Pope, do you want to go to the ghetto for lunch?" And it was like such an amazing sentence. Like I was like like our grandparents, like first of all, like the idea that you could leave the ghetto, right? But like it was not that long ago that if the Pope was coming, like you ran the other way. Like you didn't go to see the Pope, and you didn't like voluntarily go back into the ghetto. But by the way, if you've been in Rome, like that's where the best kosher food is, and it's delicious, right? And the ghetto is like a very expensive hotspot because it's in the center of the city. But like I still think about that. I still think about the fact that we're only 3 generations removed from like, but at a time where I'm not even sure how many generations could have even said that sentence. And every year, like it comes up on my Facebook, like the picture anniversary, and I still think back on that sentence. Like to live in a world where someone could say to me, "Hey, after we go say hi to after we meet the Pope, do you want to go to the ghetto and get lunch?" Like, I don't want to minimize that either, right? Like, so yes, like I want to hold and none of that cancels, right? Like none of that cancels everything that you shared, Daniel. Like all of those experiences are absolutely real. And like I also met the Pope and went to the ghetto for lunch. And I also stood alongside, right? And all of you stood together with me, with all of the other people who surrounded us after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, or after these other stories, right? Like all of those are part of our story. And so I don't want to erase any part of that.
And can
I feel
add?
better about the world hearing that the three of you don't have stories like the stories I've experienced these last few years.
Well, and Daniel, I was just going to say, I also think it's important not to minimize what is real. I mean, I put a seatbelt on in my car when I drive because I know that there are car accidents, and wearing a seatbelt can decrease the likelihood that something terrible will happen. And we should not ignore the real threats that you're describing. Obviously, those are real. They are. And I don't mean to minimize them. I just think we have to be very careful not to have them become our primary motivation or our overwhelming fear. We have to refocus our energies. I think all the time, if all the money and resources that the Jewish community is investing in what I'll call somewhat facetiously and maliciously even the anti-Semitism industry, if all of this was invested in thriving Jewish life, I just imagine what we could accomplish. Or for that matter, if it was all contributed to tzedakah, what we could accomplish as a Jewish community. And what I think sometimes, and every institution has these conversations about, well, this isn't really going to make a difference, but it'll make people feel better. I think we owe ourselves as a Jewish community, and I respect the position, Carney, that you and Daniel have sort of articulated about wanting to stand by because you don't want to be wrong. I don't want to be wrong either. But I also don't want to be wrong on the other side. I don't want to end up investing so much time and energy and resources into the anti-Semitism fears that we miss life, that we spend the whole time. It's like that midrash of that folktale of the two guys walking through the Red Sea and complaining about the mud on their shoes, and they miss the miracle. Like I don't want to miss Jewish life and all the possibilities we have because we're spending all of our time being afraid. Because
on some level, we've brought ourselves back to where we started this whole conversation.
Exactly.
Right? Which Torah, right? Oh, that, but also where we started all these conversations, right? Is it Sinai or is it Auschwitz? Where do we want to put the dagesh chazak? Where do we want to put the emphasis? I want to just share something. It's been just the yard side of Madame Colette Abu Maskat. I don't know if you know that name. She used to hold soirees in Yerushalayim. She's a spiritual teacher. And she was my mother's teacher, actually. My mom does this waking dream therapy work, which she studied with Madame Colette. And Madame Colette used to say, if you have an illness, if something is wrong, you know what? Don't spend a lot of time focusing on it, right? That's not the focus, because the more that you focus on it, the more it becomes mamashi, right? It has a life unto itself that you fuel, right? You can talk about it. I don't want to hide from it. But if you spend all the time focusing on it, it becomes the soul or the primary work that you do. I really worry about it. And let's be honest about it, okay? Who's coming to a shul where every message is a message of negativity? If you can't come to shul and sing Yismichu Hashamayim v'tagel haaretz, right? The world is a place to celebrate. Who's coming back? My kid's not coming back if every story is about, they tried to kill us, like that's not what we're coming back for. And so we need to have a lot of those stories of joy and celebration, the moments when we joined hands with people of common beliefs, even if they are not of the same religious tradition as we are. The stories of brotherhood and sisterhood, of commonality, those are things that we can celebrate. And I would say, as much as I'm standing on guard to see what happens, those are much more the stories of my life, at least, much more the people who have reached out to us, much more of the stories of the existence of these congregations. You know how people come up, I just like to take a look at this beautiful building. And what's sad to me is the people sitting at the front desk who are now volunteers in our environment, they're nervous. Rabbi, is it okay if I let them in to look at the sanctuary? I said, that'll mean a lot more people will look at this beautiful sanctuary that Gio Obato designed, and we spent more money than we should ever have spent on, right? Come in, get inspired. You know what? You want to pray? Pray. Like, use the space. Let's not be in this position where we're so worried that everybody's out to get us. Now, by the same token, some people, you got to ask the question. You got to be a little sensitive. You got to let people in. But I don't, semi-permeable membrane, maybe that's exactly where we need to go, right? I just want to make sure not to create a Judaism that's always about doom and gloom and sadness, and they're out to get us all the time. That does nothing for us. And as we think now about handing this over to the next generation of young people, where are they going to want to come? Where there's simcha, layudim aita ora, v'simcha, v'sason, v'ikar. It's all about light and goodness and happiness and celebration, not Yiskadal v'yiskada shemei rabbah, because that will be nowhere. We'll be saying Kaddish for ourselves if we continue in that fashion.
So we're just about out of time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this conversation, for these perspectives. Does anyone have a final parting thought here? Okay.
Thank you for your courage sharing your stories, Daniel. I mean, that's part of the, we all have to feel safe sharing our truths.
I'm very heartened to hear that my experiences have not been y'all's experiences. Yeah, I'm going to reflect.
By the way, I'm equally disheartened that those have been your experience. I want to share. It's not that
Yes.
It hurts me. It hurts me for you, because when you first told me, I could hear. And I was in a store and I was trying to talk to you, and I felt terrible, but you sounded scared, Daniel. And it hurt me that you felt, that's what you sounded. Maybe I didn't hear you well.
I didn't grow up with this, right? I grew up at CRC. I grew up with a Judaism that was very much not the Judaism of anti-Semitism. It was not a Torah of anti-Semitism. And I don't think it's the Torah that I normally teach.
Right.
But
I worry about that. I just want to give you a little chizuk that you should know that there's so much to be joyous about. And, I'd asked, I don't know if we're going to get to do it, but I asked that we have min hametzar, right? Out of this, from the dire straits, I call unto you, God, right? Anani, answer me, Bamer Chavya, in the expansiveness, right? It's not that there isn't sadness. But the question is, are we going to look at this narrowness? Are we going to look at the expansiveness? And I think I'd like to focus my time on that which is expansive, which is the growing edge of religious life in America, which we have the ability to actually, in some small ways, direct from the middle of the country, right? There are amazing things that are happening as I think about this amazing Jewish community that we have here, the creativity, the innovation, the passion, the diversity. It is amazing to me. And I only take stock of it midday palm from time to time. And I think we should take stock of the positivity and the blessings that abound. And so I want to, talk about Mina Meitzah, not because I'm kvetching, but I'm putting myself in a narrow place. I want to get out of that narrow place. I want to get to an expansive place. So I don't know if we're going to do it. If not, I said the words anyway.
We'll end with Mina Meitzar. Rory, then Jim.
No, I just wanted to thank you for this discussion, and also to just lift up. I hope at no point, right? Just in case, none of this is canceling anything that you said, right? This is the and that we always come back to, and everything that you shared is absolutely true. And I think that's also right. It's part of the totality of the experience. And I think, and I'm holding that as real stories, not necessarily as my story, but as real stories, while I also hold a lot of hope for the other stories that I've experienced. And I think, and I think the reason that we're able to move forward to a place of hope is because I think, we're putting on our seatbelt, like Jim said, right? Like, I think we're going in eyes wide open. But I think that, with this idea, I love what Carney's just saying, right? Like, to keep moving towards a place of expansiveness. I don't want people to tell me that there's no future for us, right? Like, there's a future for us because all of us are doing the work of building that future. And some days are going to be harder than others, and sometimes that work is going to be more of a challenge. But we're all doing that work, and none of us are walking away from it. And so that gives me hope.
I have nothing to add other than just, yes, thank you. Thanks for this conversation. Thanks for the chavruta that we have. And thanks to all of those who are joining us every time. I look forward to whatever conversations we have next. There's so many ways we can move forward, and we will.